There is no rehabilitation for someone who could do what you did. There is no amount of time that will change who you are or what you're capable of. I will have no sympathy for you, lady. By this court, you are hereby sentenced to life without parole.
It was March 14, 2014. The spring rain was falling softly on the small suburban neighborhood of Maple Ridge, just outside Denver, Colorado, when Patricia Ashford first noticed that something was terribly wrong with her mother. It was a Saturday morning, and Patricia had stopped by her mother's house to pick up some casserole dishes she'd lent her for a church potluck the week before. Her mother, Dorothy Ashford, was 73 years old, a widow of 6 years, living alone in the same two-story colonial house where she'd raised Patricia and her 2 brothers. Dorothy had always been the kind of woman who seemed indestructible, active in her church, volunteering at the community center, hosting family dinners every Sunday, the kind of grandmother who could keep up with 5 grandchildren at once and somehow still have energy to bake cookies afterward. But that Saturday morning, Dorothy seemed different. She was moving slowly, shuffling rather than walking, and there was a grayish pallor to her skin that Patricia hadn't noticed before. Dorothy was sitting at her kitchen table in her bathrobe at 9 o'clock in the morning, which was unusual. Dorothy was normally dressed and put together by 6 o'clock, no matter what day of the week it was. "Mom, are you okay?" Patricia asked, setting down her purse and moving to the refrigerator to put away the casserole dishes. "You look tired." "I'm fine, sweetheart," Dorothy said, but her voice sounded weak, almost distant. "Just didn't sleep well last night. Your mother's getting old, I guess." Patricia pulled out a chair and sat down across from her mother. She reached out and felt Dorothy's forehead. It was cool to the touch, not warm, so probably not a fever. But something was off. Patricia had worked as a school nurse for 15 years. She was one of the most respected nurses in the Denver school district, known for her competence and her genuine care for the students and staff. She had good instincts about health, and her instincts were telling her that something wasn't right with her mother. "When's the last time you ate something?" Patricia asked. Dorothy waved a hand dismissively. "I had some tea this morning. That's all I've wanted. My stomach's been a little off, but it'll pass. You know how it is, sometimes your body just needs a day to reset." Patricia wanted to push further, but her mother had always been stubborn, and Patricia had learned over the years that pushing too hard usually just made Dorothy more defensive. Patricia decided to make her mother some tea and toast, something light but nourishing. As she bustled around the kitchen, preparing the food, she kept watching her mother out of the corner of her eye. Dorothy seemed to be moving in slow motion, even her thoughts seemed sluggish. By the time Patricia set down a plate of buttered toast and a cup of chamomile tea in front of her, Dorothy had dozed off in her chair. Patricia let her sleep and cleaned up the kitchen, washing the casserole dishes and putting them away. Before she left, she kissed her mother on the forehead and made a mental note to call her later in the afternoon to check in. She wasn't too worried. People got minor illnesses all the time, and at 73, Dorothy was certainly entitled to have days where she felt under the weather. Still, Patricia filed away the observation in her mind. She was the type of person who noticed details, who paid attention to things that seemed off, even if she couldn't quite put her finger on what the problem was. If you're watching this and you've ever had a family member get sick and something just felt wrong about it, I want to hear from you in the comments below. Let me know, did your instincts end up being correct? And please, if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. We explore cases that the mainstream media often overlooks, cases where family betrayal reaches depths most people can't even imagine. Your support helps us continue bringing you these stories, and I genuinely want to hear your thoughts on what you're about to watch. Now, let's go back to that spring of 2014, because what Patricia didn't know at that moment was that her mother was already dying. Slowly, methodically, deliberately. And the person responsible for Dorothy's death was someone Dorothy loved, someone she trusted completely, someone she'd raised and nurtured and cared for her entire life. Someone she considered not just family but a confidant, a friend, someone she was genuinely proud of. That person was Dorothy's daughter-in-law, Rebecca Winters. To understand how we got here, we need to go back further. We need to understand who Rebecca Winters was, what she wanted, and how she came to believe that poisoning her mother-in-law was the answer to her problems. Rebecca Winters grew up in a small town in rural Wyoming, a place where opportunities were limited and futures seemed to be predetermined by accident of birth. Her father, Michael Winters, was a drunk who worked sporadically in oil fields and spent most of his money on alcohol. Her mother, Susan, was a woman who'd given up on her own dreams years ago and had channeled all of her energy into trying to manage her husband's alcoholism and keep the family functioning on whatever income they could scrape together. Rebecca had one older brother, Travis, who'd gotten out of Wyoming the first chance he had, joining the military at 18 and never looking back. Rebecca had been smarter than to stay in that dead-end town. She was intelligent, driven, and determined to build a better life for herself. She'd gotten good grades in high school despite the chaos at home. She'd worked part-time jobs throughout her high school years, saving money, planning her escape. When she graduated, she'd applied to nursing programs at several different universities, and she'd gotten into the University of Colorado at Boulder, one of the top nursing schools in the country. Her parents couldn't afford to help pay for her education. Rebecca had put herself through nursing school on scholarship, working part-time as a waitress and a cashier at a grocery store, sleeping only 5 hours a night, pushing herself harder than she'd ever pushed before. By the time she graduated with her nursing degree at age 23, she was exhausted but triumphant. She'd done it. She'd escaped Wyoming. She had a profession, a future, a way out of poverty and dysfunction. She got a job at Denver Memorial Hospital, working in the intensive care unit. The ICU was intense and demanding, but it was also where the best nurses worked, where the most skilled, most dedicated medical professionals were concentrated. Rebecca thrived in that environment. She was methodical, detail-oriented, and genuinely good at her job. She had a reputation for being someone you wanted taking care of you if you were seriously ill. She was calm under pressure, knowledgeable about complex medical situations, and compassionate toward patients and families who were going through the most terrifying experiences of their lives. When Rebecca was 28 years old, she met David Ashford at a hospital fundraiser. David worked in finance, was 7 years older than Rebecca, came from a solidly upper-middle-class family, and was everything Rebecca's father wasn't: stable, employed, educated, ambitious. David was handsome in a conventional way, with blonde hair that was always perfectly styled and expensive clothes that fit him well. He drove a BMW and lived in a nice apartment in a good neighborhood. When he asked Rebecca out, she said yes immediately. David was immediately smitten with Rebecca. She was intelligent, beautiful in an understated way, and she had a quality that David's other girlfriends hadn't possessed: a seriousness about life, a sense that she was working toward something, building something real. They dated for 2 years. Then David proposed with a diamond ring that cost more than Rebecca made in 3 months. Rebecca said yes, and they got married in a small ceremony at a non-denominational church, with only family and close friends invited. Rebecca quit working full-time at the hospital, not because David demanded it, but because she wanted to have more balance in her life. She picked up a few shifts a month just to keep her skills current, but mostly she focused on being a good wife and thinking about having children. She and David bought a house in Maple Ridge, an upper-middle-class suburb just outside Denver. The house was beautiful, a 4-bedroom colonial with a 2-car garage and a backyard with mature trees. It was the kind of house Rebecca had only dreamed about as a girl in Wyoming. For the first few years of their marriage, things were good. Rebecca was happy, or at least she appeared to be. She was part of David's family now, which meant she was part of a world she'd never really experienced before. A world where money wasn't constantly tight, where you didn't have to worry about paying the electric bill, where you could make decisions based on what you wanted rather than what you could afford. David's mother, Dorothy, welcomed Rebecca into the family warmly. Dorothy had raised 3 sons and she'd always wanted a daughter. In many ways, Dorothy treated Rebecca more like a daughter than a daughter-in-law. She took Rebecca to lunch. She invited her to her book club. She introduced her to her friends. She seemed genuinely delighted to have a daughter-in-law, especially one who was intelligent and accomplished and had her own career. But over the years, something shifted. Rebecca wanted to have children, but she and David had trouble conceiving. They went through 3 rounds of fertility treatment, each one more expensive and more invasive than the last. None of them worked. Rebecca began to spiral into depression. She'd built her entire adult life around the assumption that she would have children, that she would be a mother, that this would be the next chapter of her story. When that didn't happen, she felt like her life had stalled out. She wasn't getting any younger. She was 36, 37, 38 years old, and the window for having children was closing. She went back to work full-time at the hospital to distract herself. But even that wasn't enough to fill the void. She and David's marriage began to strain under the weight of her disappointment. David wanted to move on, to accept that maybe they wouldn't have biological children, that maybe they could adopt or just accept a child-free life. Rebecca couldn't accept it. She felt like she was failing at the most important thing a woman was supposed to do. And then one day something changed. Rebecca's brother Travis, who'd been out of touch for years, called her out of the blue. He said he was coming to Colorado for a visit and he wanted to see his sister. When Travis arrived, he brought someone with him, a woman named Jennifer who was his wife. They'd gotten married quietly, and they had a 4-year-old daughter named Sophie, and Jennifer was pregnant with their second child. Travis had found the life that Rebecca couldn't seem to build. He had a family, a wife, children. The unfairness of it burned in Rebecca's chest. She'd worked so hard, sacrificed so much, and she had nothing. Travis had always been the one who seemed like he'd throw his life away, and he'd ended up with everything she wanted. For a few months after Travis's visit, Rebecca spiraled deeper into depression. She stopped going to work. She stopped leaving the house. She spent hours on the internet looking at adoption agencies and fertility clinics, researching procedures she couldn't afford, reading stories from women who'd managed to conceive after years of infertility. She was obsessed with the idea of having a child, with the idea that somewhere out there was a solution to her problem, if she just looked hard enough or wanted it badly enough. David encouraged her to see a therapist. Rebecca went to a few sessions and then stopped. She said the therapist didn't understand, that the therapist didn't have infertility, so how could she possibly understand what Rebecca was going through? She rejected every suggestion for help, every attempt by David to support her or get her through this crisis. She was determined to suffer, it seemed, determined to wallow in her unhappiness, determined to make sure that everyone around her understood how much pain she was in. And then gradually Rebecca's depression began to shift. It didn't disappear. Depression never just disappears, but it began to curdle into something else. It began to transform into anger. Specifically, anger at Dorothy. Rebecca had always been close to Dorothy. Dorothy was the mother Rebecca never had, the woman who treated her with kindness and affection and seemed to genuinely love her for who she was. But Rebecca began to see Dorothy differently. She began to focus on the fact that Dorothy had easily had 3 children, had become a grandmother multiple times, had experienced all the things that Rebecca desperately wanted but couldn't have. Dorothy had been given so much, Rebecca thought, and she'd squandered it. She'd complained about being a mother. She talked about how hard it was to raise 3 boys. She hadn't appreciated what she had. And more than that, Rebecca began to resent Dorothy for being alive. This thought wasn't fully conscious at first. It lurked at the edges of Rebecca's mind, something she didn't quite allow herself to articulate. But it was there. If Dorothy died, Rebecca thought, then the Ashford family inheritance would be divided among the 3 sons. David would get 1/3 of his mother's estate, which was substantial. Dorothy owned her house outright, had invested wisely over the years, had accumulated enough wealth to leave a meaningful inheritance. With that money, Rebecca thought, she and David could afford fertility treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. She could finally have the child she so desperately wanted. With that money, she could build the life that she deserved. It's a thought that most people have and immediately dismiss as monstrous. But Rebecca didn't dismiss it. She sat with it. She explored it. She began to think about what it would take. She began to research. Rebecca was a nurse. She knew about medications, about dosages, about how different drugs affected the human body. She knew that certain medications, when combined with other medications, could cause problems. She knew that some poisons could be difficult to detect in a toxicology report if you didn't know what you were looking for. She had access to medications at the hospital. She had knowledge that most people didn't have. She had opportunity. She began to plan. It started very subtly, in the spring of 2014, right around the time Patricia noticed that something was off with Dorothy. Rebecca had always been very involved in Dorothy's life. She called her frequently. She took her to doctor's appointments. She brought her meals. She was the perfect daughter-in-law, the kind of woman Dorothy bragged about to her friends. Rebecca started suggesting that Dorothy might benefit from certain vitamins or supplements. She'd read an article, she said, about how women Dorothy's age often had deficiencies that could cause fatigue and general malaise. She brought Dorothy bottles of supplements, multivitamins, B-complex vitamins, magnesium. Dorothy took them gratefully, never suspecting anything was wrong. But Rebecca was also doing something else. At Dorothy's house, Rebecca would prepare tea for her mother-in-law. She'd make Dorothy lunch. She'd bring her cookies she'd baked at home. And into some of these gifts, Rebecca had mixed small amounts of medications that she'd obtained from the hospital. Medications that, in small doses, wouldn't cause alarm. Medications that would cause general symptoms: fatigue, weakness, nausea, confusion. Symptoms that could be attributed to aging, to a minor illness, to stress. Rebecca knew exactly what she was doing. She'd researched it carefully. She understood that if she gave Dorothy a large dose of poison all at once, it would be obvious what had happened. An autopsy would reveal it. There would be questions. But if she poisoned Dorothy slowly, building up the medications in her system over weeks and weeks, it would be harder to detect. Dorothy's organs would slowly fail. It would look like natural causes. An elderly woman's body simply giving out. And Rebecca had time. She was willing to take months to do this. Dorothy was 73. If she died in the next 6 months, it wouldn't raise suspicion. People died all the time. Old people especially. There would be sadness, but there would also be acceptance. This was the natural order of things. No one would suspect that it was anything but natural causes. Patricia kept calling her mother throughout March and April of 2014, checking in on her, worried about the fatigue and weakness that Dorothy was experiencing. Dorothy assured her that she was fine, that she was just going through a phase, that she'd probably been working too hard at the church and needed to scale back her activities. Patricia suggested that Dorothy see a doctor, but Dorothy resisted. She didn't like doctors, she said. Doctors always made you feel like something was wrong with you even when you were fine. In May, Dorothy's condition seemed to improve. She had more energy. She seemed more like herself. Patricia was relieved. Whatever it was, it had passed. But that was because Rebecca had decreased the doses for a few weeks. Rebecca was testing something. She wanted to see if Dorothy's improvement came when the medication stopped. It did. This confirmed to Rebecca that the problem wasn't something medical, something that would show up in blood work, something that a doctor would catch. The problem was the medications Rebecca was giving her. And if Rebecca could control when Dorothy got better and when Dorothy got sick, then Rebecca had all the power. She could keep doing this indefinitely if she wanted to. She could keep Dorothy sick enough that it seemed like natural aging and decline, but not sick enough that it would trigger a doctor visit or test that might reveal what was happening. By July of 2014, Rebecca began increasing the doses again. She wanted Dorothy to get sicker, weaker, more dependent on Rebecca. She wanted Dorothy's family to get used to the idea that Dorothy was in declining health. She wanted this to become the new normal so that when Dorothy finally died, everyone would accept it as inevitable. Rebecca started spending even more time at Dorothy's house. She'd go over several times a week, ostensibly to help with household tasks, to do laundry, to prepare meals. But really she was there to administer the medications. She'd put them in Dorothy's food. She'd mix them into her tea. She'd suggest that Dorothy take certain supplements, handing her pills that weren't supplements at all. Dorothy was becoming a ghost of her former self. She was losing weight. She was sleeping 12, 14, 16 hours a day. She'd forget things. She'd have moments of confusion. She'd be lucid one moment and foggy the next. Her friends at church expressed concern. They'd see her at services on Sundays, but she wasn't participating in activities anymore. She wasn't volunteering. She wasn't hosting dinners. She'd become reclusive, staying in her house most of the time. David noticed the changes in his mother and he was worried. He called Patricia and his youngest brother Michael. They should check on Mom more often, he said. She didn't seem like herself. Patricia had been checking on her frequently, and she shared David's concerns. But Dorothy kept insisting that everything was fine, that she was just tired, that she was slowing down as she got older. There was nothing wrong that seeing a doctor would fix. It wasn't until late August of 2014 that things came to a head. Patricia showed up at her mother's house on a Wednesday afternoon and found Dorothy in bed, barely conscious. Dorothy's skin was gray. Her breathing was shallow. Patricia immediately called 911. The ambulance arrived within minutes. The paramedics looked at Dorothy and made the quick assessment that she was in serious medical distress. They rushed her to Denver Memorial Hospital, the same hospital where Rebecca worked. Dorothy was admitted to the intensive care unit. The doctors ran batteries of tests, blood work, imaging, toxicology screens. At first, the results were confusing. Dorothy's organs were showing signs of stress, particularly her liver and kidneys. Her blood chemistry was all wrong. But the doctors couldn't figure out what was causing it. There was no clear diagnosis. No single disease that explained her symptoms. A liver specialist was brought in. A nephrologist. A cardiologist. They all examined Dorothy and reviewed her tests and scratched their heads. This was unusual. It looked almost like Dorothy had been poisoned, but the toxicology screens came back negative. The doctors were stumped. Rebecca, who worked in the ICU at Denver Memorial, made sure to visit her mother-in-law during her shifts. She would check on Dorothy, adjust her for, sit beside her bed and hold her hand. The nurses and doctors who saw Rebecca with Dorothy thought she was a devoted daughter-in-law, a woman who deeply loved her mother-in-law and was devastated by her sudden illness. No one suspected that Rebecca was the reason Dorothy was in the hospital in the first place. Dorothy stabilized somewhat after a few days. She regained consciousness. She could speak, though her voice was weak. She couldn't explain how she'd gotten so sick. She said she just felt increasingly tired over the past few months, and then one day she just couldn't get out of bed. The doctors continued to run tests, but nothing definitive emerged. Eventually, they started treating her symptomatically, supporting her organs, monitoring her, trying to help her body heal itself. And slowly, Dorothy did begin to improve. Over the course of 2 weeks, she regained strength. Her blood work started to normalize. Her organs began to recover. The doctors decided that whatever had caused Dorothy's crisis, her body was now fighting it off. They discharged her after 3 weeks in the hospital with instructions to follow up with her primary care physician, to get regular blood work, and to return to the hospital immediately if she experienced any symptoms like the ones she'd had before. Rebecca drove Dorothy home from the hospital. During the car ride, Rebecca held Dorothy's hand and told her how scared she'd been, how much she loved her, how relieved she was that Dorothy was going to be okay. Dorothy squeezed Rebecca's hand weakly and told her that she didn't know what she would do without her. Rebecca just smiled. The moment they got back to Dorothy's house, Rebecca started her plan all over again. Comment below if you've ever trusted someone completely and later found out they were capable of something terrible. Tell me if you've ever looked back on a relationship and realized that someone was manipulating you the entire time. Your stories matter and I want to hear them. The second round of poisoning was different from the first. Rebecca knew that the hospital was now watching Dorothy, that there would be doctor's appointments and blood work and attention to Dorothy's health. So Rebecca had to be more careful. She had to give Dorothy doses small enough that they wouldn't show up in standard blood work, doses spread out over longer periods, doses that mimicked natural aging and decline rather than acute poisoning. Dorothy was discharged from the hospital in September of 2014. By October, she was already starting to decline again. She was tired. She had no appetite. She was forgetful. She'd call Patricia and leave confused messages, saying things that didn't quite make sense, talking about people who weren't there, forgetting what day it was. Patricia was deeply concerned. She suggested that her mother see a neurologist, that maybe Dorothy had early-onset dementia or Alzheimer's. Dorothy resisted. She said she was just old, that her mind wasn't as sharp as it used to be, that was normal at her age. Patricia pushed back gently, but Dorothy remained firm. She didn't want to see any more doctors. She'd had enough of hospitals and tests and people poking and prodding at her. What Patricia didn't know was that Dorothy was terrified. Dorothy was starting to suspect that something was very wrong with her, that her decline wasn't natural aging, that something specific had changed in her life that had caused her health to deteriorate. She was starting to suspect Rebecca. It was a vague suspicion at first, barely conscious. But it grew as the weeks went on. Rebecca was always at the house. Rebecca was always preparing food for her. Rebecca was always suggesting that Dorothy take certain vitamins or supplements. Rebecca was always there, hovering, attentive, solicitous, and yet Dorothy felt worse and worse. In November of 2014, Dorothy called David and asked him to come over. When David arrived, Dorothy was sitting at her kitchen table, looking as serious as David had ever seen her. "I need to tell you something," Dorothy said, her voice quiet. "And I don't know how you're going to react, but I need to tell you anyway. I think something is very wrong with Rebecca." David's stomach dropped. His first thought was that Dorothy was going to tell him that she suspected Rebecca of having an affair, or of being unfaithful in some way. He braced himself. "I think she's poisoning me," Dorothy said. David stared at his mother. "Did you just say you think Rebecca is poisoning you?" "Yes," Dorothy said. "I know how it sounds. I know it sounds crazy. But think about it, David. I was fine until Rebecca started bringing me supplements and vitamins and preparing food for me. I was fine until she came into my life in this new way, spending all this time at my house. And now I'm sick. Really sick. And every time I get a little better, she comes over and I get sick again." David wanted to dismiss this as the ramblings of a confused old woman. But Dorothy was coherent. She was articulate. She laid out everything she'd noticed, every time she'd felt worse after Rebecca had been at her house, every supplement Rebecca had insisted she take. "But Mom," David said, "Rebecca is a nurse. She knows medicine. Why would she poison you?" Dorothy didn't have a good answer to that question. She didn't understand Rebecca's motivation. But she was certain about her suspicion. She could feel it in her bones. Something was very wrong. David was torn. He loved his mother. But he also loved his wife. The idea that Rebecca would do something like this, it was incomprehensible. It didn't match with who he knew Rebecca to be. And yet, his mother wasn't the type to make wild accusations. She was sensible, grounded, not prone to conspiracy theories or paranoia. He decided to confront Rebecca. That evening when he got home, he called her into the study and closed the door. "Rebecca, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you have any kind of negative feelings toward my mother? Has something happened between you and her that I don't know about?" Rebecca's face went carefully blank. She was good at that, at controlling her expression, at appearing innocent when she needed to. Of course not, David said. Your mother is wonderful. I love her. Where is this coming from? My mother thinks you're poisoning her, David said, and then he waited to see how Rebecca would react. For just a moment, Rebecca's composure slipped. Her eyes widened. Her breathing became shallow. She looked panicked, but then she recovered. That's insane, Rebecca said, and there was genuine emotion in her voice now. Anger, hurt, betrayal. How could she say something like that about me? How could you even listen to something like that? David, your mother is declining. She's confused. She's elderly and she's not thinking clearly anymore. And now she's lashing out at me because I'm the one who spends the most time with her, the one who's actually trying to help her. But David could see something in his wife's eyes that he'd never seen before. Something that frightened him. A coldness. A calculation. A moment where he could see that Rebecca's emotional reaction was performative, that underneath it was something else, something darker. I think we should get my mother a toxicology test, David said. I think we should have her tested to see if there are any unusual substances in her system. Rebecca's reaction was immediate and visceral. No, she said. Absolutely not. If you do that, if you accuse me of something like that without any proof, it will destroy our marriage. And it will destroy your relationship with your mother. Is that what you want, David? Because that's what's going to happen. David felt himself backing down. Rebecca was right in a way. If he pushed this theory and it turned out to be wrong, the fallout would be devastating. His marriage would be damaged. His mother would feel betrayed by the accusation, even though she'd been the one to make it. Everyone would look like the victim of Rebecca's manipulation. He decided to drop it. He told his mother that Rebecca had denied the accusation, that it was probably just Dorothy's confusion and fear manifesting as paranoia about someone she was close to. He suggested that maybe Dorothy should see a therapist, that maybe she was experiencing some early cognitive decline that was making her suspicious and anxious. Dorothy accepted this explanation, but she didn't feel reassured. She knew what she knew. She knew that something was wrong with Rebecca. She just couldn't prove it. But Dorothy also knew something else. She was going to die if this continued. She could feel it in her body, could feel her organs struggling, could feel herself getting weaker and weaker. And she knew that if she confronted Rebecca or tried to prevent Rebecca from being around her, Rebecca would just find another way. Rebecca would make sure that Dorothy died. So Dorothy made a decision. She was going to document everything. She was going to keep a journal of every time Rebecca visited, every time she felt sick, every time Rebecca gave her something to eat or drink. She was going to write down the dates and times and what she'd consumed. And if she died, if the poisoning was successful, then at least there would be a record. At least there would be evidence. Dorothy started keeping her journal in a small notebook that she hid in the back of her nightstand, beneath the books she kept there. Every time Rebecca came over, Dorothy wrote down the time and what Rebecca had brought or prepared. Every time Dorothy felt sick afterward, she wrote that down too. She documented her symptoms, her confusion, her weakness, her fear. And then, in December of 2014, something unexpected happened. Rebecca got pregnant. The news came out of nowhere. Rebecca had been trying to get pregnant for so long, and she'd given up hope. She'd accepted that she and David would likely not have biological children. And then, suddenly she was pregnant. The fertility treatments had worked, finally, or perhaps she'd gotten pregnant naturally, the way these things sometimes happen when you stop trying so hard. Rebecca was overjoyed. David was ecstatic. The whole family was excited. And something changed in Rebecca. The obsession that had driven her to poison Dorothy began to fade just slightly. Not enough to stop the poisoning entirely, but enough that she relaxed her vigilance a bit. She was going to have a baby. She was going to get the thing she'd wanted more than anything. And that, somehow, made her feel like everything was going to be okay. But Dorothy knew better. Dorothy knew that Rebecca would try to use her as a way to control the inheritance, to ensure that there was enough money for the baby, to make sure that Dorothy's death would provide the financial cushion Rebecca felt she needed. Dorothy also knew that she was running out of time. She could feel her body shutting down. She didn't think she could survive another few months of this. She needed to do something and she needed to do it soon. In January of 2015, Dorothy took her journal and she gave copies of it to Patricia and David. She sat them down in her living room and she told them everything. Her suspicions about Rebecca, the symptoms she'd been experiencing, the pattern she'd noticed, the journal entries documenting it all. Patricia read through her mother's journal with growing horror. The dates, the times, the correlation between Rebecca's visits and Dorothy's symptom flare-ups. It was all there. It was like reading a confession written in advance. "We need to go to the police," Patricia said immediately. But David was hesitant. This was still his wife. These were still accusations that could destroy his marriage. He wanted to believe that there was an explanation, that his mother was misinterpreting things, that there had to be a logical reason for all of this that didn't involve his wife deliberately poisoning his mother. "Mom," David said, "I believe that you believe this. But I need actual proof. A journal isn't proof. This is all circumstantial. We need something concrete." Dorothy was frustrated, but she understood. She agreed to go to her doctor and to request a full toxicology screen, the most comprehensive test available, the kind that would detect even small amounts of unusual substances in her system. The test was scheduled for the following week. Dorothy was hopeful. She was going to get proof. She was going to show David and Patricia exactly what Rebecca had been doing. She was going to stop this and she was going to survive. But Rebecca found the journal. Rebecca was at Dorothy's house on the afternoon of the same day that Dorothy had given copies to Patricia and David. She was helping Dorothy with some household tasks. Dishes, laundry, the things that Rebecca had become responsible for over the months. And while Dorothy was in the bedroom, Rebecca looked through her purse looking for something and found the journal. Rebecca read through the pages and felt her blood turn to ice. Dorothy knew. Dorothy had documented everything. Dorothy was going to the police. Dorothy had already told David and Patricia. Rebecca's mind raced. She had a few days before Dorothy's toxicology appointment. A few days to figure out what to do. She could flee. She could disappear. But where would she go? She was pregnant. She had a husband, a life, a future that she'd finally managed to build for herself. Or she could finish what she'd started. She could give Dorothy a final dose, a dose large enough to be fatal, a dose that would appear to be a natural death, a dose that would happen before Dorothy could get to that doctor's appointment and that toxicology test. Rebecca made her decision. On January 22, 2015, Rebecca brought Dorothy a bowl of soup for lunch. The soup was warm and fragrant and smelled delicious. Dorothy was hungry, she'd been eating very little for months, and the smell of the soup made her mouth water. She ate every spoonful, not knowing that the soup contained enough medication to stop her heart. An hour later, Dorothy began to feel dizzy. Her chest felt tight. She called out for Rebecca, who was in the other room. Rebecca came and found Dorothy struggling to breathe. She called 911, and she held Dorothy's hand while they waited for the ambulance. She cried. She told Dorothy that she loved her, that everything was going to be okay, that the ambulance was coming. But it was too late. Dorothy's heart stopped before the ambulance arrived. The paramedics performed CPR, but they couldn't revive her. Dorothy Ashford was dead. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac failure, brought on by age and underlying health conditions. There was no autopsy. Dorothy's family was devastated but not shocked. She was 73 years old. Her health had been declining. This was sad, but it was also the natural order of things. Dorothy was cremated. Her funeral was held at her church, and hundreds of people came to pay their respects. Friends, family, colleagues from her various volunteer positions, people whose lives she'd touched over the years. Rebecca sat in the front row next to David, and she cried. She looked like a woman devastated by the loss of someone she loved. If you're watching this right now and your stomach is turning, if you're feeling that sense of wrongness about what Rebecca did, I need you to comment below and tell me how this story is making you feel. Tell me about your reaction to someone who could do something this calculated, this cruel, this deliberate. And please, if you value these kinds of deep dives into true crime cases, subscribe to the channel. We're going to explore what happens next, and it's going to challenge everything you think you know about justice and punishment. For the first month after Dorothy's death, everything seemed to settle into a kind of normalcy. Rebecca was grieving or appearing to grieve. David was grieving. Patricia and her brothers were grieving. Life went on as it always does after someone dies. But Patricia couldn't stop thinking about her mother's journal. Even though Dorothy was dead, even though there was nothing that could be done to bring her back, Patricia felt like she owed it to her mother to pursue this. She felt like if she didn't, then Rebecca had won completely. Rebecca had killed Dorothy, had gotten away with it, and had faced no consequences at all. Patricia decided to go to the police. She brought Dorothy's journal with her, and she told the detectives everything that her mother had documented, everything that Dorothy had suspected. She told them about Dorothy's sudden decline, about the hospital stay, about the improvement when Rebecca wasn't giving her medications, about the decline that followed. The detectives took her seriously, but they were skeptical. A journal wasn't proof of poisoning. Dorothy's death had been ruled as cardiac failure. There was no evidence of a crime. But they agreed to investigate. They would exhume Dorothy's body and perform an autopsy. They would run a full toxicology screen, the kind that would detect even minute amounts of unusual substances. Rebecca was arrested in April of 2015, 2 months after Dorothy's death, as she was leaving the hospital where she worked. The arrest was sudden and public and humiliating. Her co-workers saw the police leading her away in handcuffs. Her picture was on the news. The pregnant woman who'd allegedly poisoned her mother-in-law. David was shocked and devastated. He'd hoped that the police investigation would clear Rebecca, that there would turn out to be a logical explanation. But the evidence that came back from the autopsy was damning. Dorothy's body contained significant quantities of several medications that she'd never been prescribed: sleeping pills, anti-anxiety medication, pain medication, all in amounts that, when combined, were toxic to the human body. The autopsy report was clear. Dorothy Ashford had been poisoned. Someone had deliberately and systematically given her medications in lethal doses over a period of months. The coroner changed the cause of death from cardiac failure to poisoning, and immediately the case became a murder investigation. Rebecca was charged with first-degree murder. She was held without bail, given the severity of the charges and the danger she posed to others. She was still pregnant when she was arrested. She gave birth to a beautiful girl in the county jail while awaiting trial. She named her Sophie after Travis's daughter, and she held her newborn and cried and wondered how her life had spiraled into something so dark. The trial began in September of 2015, 6 months after Dorothy's death. The prosecutor was a woman named Sarah Michaels, a veteran of the district attorney's office who had handled dozens of murder cases. She was a formidable presence, tall and imposing, with steel-gray eyes and a voice that commanded attention. Sarah methodically built the case against Rebecca piece by piece. She presented the autopsy report, showing the jury exactly what toxic medications had been found in Dorothy's system and in what quantities. She presented expert testimony from toxicologists who explained how these medications, when combined and given over time, would slowly poison the body, causing exactly the symptoms that Dorothy had experienced: fatigue, confusion, weakness, organ failure. She presented Dorothy's journal, which she read aloud to the jury, entry by entry. Hearing Dorothy's own words describing her suspicions, her fear, her realization that someone she loved was trying to kill her, it was devastatingly effective. Several jurors were crying by the time Sarah finished reading. She presented testimony from the hospital about what medications were available and how access to the pharmacy worked, establishing that Rebecca, as a nurse, would have had easy access to the medications that were used to poison Dorothy. She presented testimony from David, who reluctantly admitted that his mother had expressed her suspicions to him, that she'd asked him to get a toxicology test, that Rebecca had strongly objected to the idea. She presented testimony from Patricia, who described her mother's decline, her hospital stay, her recovery, and her subsequent deterioration. Patricia was a compelling witness. She was a nurse herself, so she understood the medical aspects of what had happened. She could speak credibly about what was and wasn't consistent with natural aging. And she spoke about her mother with genuine love and respect, with obvious grief over the loss of someone who'd been wrongly taken from her. The defense attorney, a man named Russell Chin, argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that while it seemed clear that Dorothy had been poisoned, it wasn't entirely certain who had done it. He suggested that maybe Dorothy had poisoned herself, either deliberately or accidentally. He suggested that maybe there was someone else who had access to medications and to Dorothy's home and who had a reason to want her dead. But Russell was grasping at straws. The evidence against Rebecca was overwhelming. She had access, motive, the inheritance, means, medications, and opportunity. She was at Dorothy's house frequently. She'd been the one giving Dorothy supplements and preparing food for her. She'd objected strongly when Dorothy wanted to get a toxicology test. She'd been at Dorothy's house on the day that Dorothy died, and she'd been the one to call 911. After 3 weeks of testimony and evidence, the jury deliberated for only 6 hours. They returned with a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Rebecca showed no emotion when the verdict was read. She sat very still, her hands folded in front of her, her face completely blank. It was as if she'd already accepted this outcome, as if somewhere deep down she'd known that this was how it would end. The sentencing hearing came 3 weeks later. Rebecca's attorneys made a passionate plea for mercy. They talked about Rebecca's difficult childhood, her struggles with infertility, her mental health issues, her pregnancy, her newborn daughter who would grow up without a mother. They asked the judge to consider a sentence of life with the possibility of parole at some point, rather than life without parole. Sarah Michaels gave a powerful rebuttal. She talked about the premeditation that was evident in Rebecca's actions, the careful planning, the systematic poisoning, the deliberate cover-up. She talked about Dorothy, who had been a loving grandmother, a dedicated volunteer, a woman who'd enriched the lives of everyone around her. She talked about the cruelty of what Rebecca had done, the violation of trust, the slow torture of watching yourself being poisoned by someone you loved and trusted. And then Dorothy's journal entries were read again, this time directly to the judge. Hearing the words of a dying woman written in her own hand documenting her murder in real time, it was devastating and powerful and impossible to ignore. Judge Thomas Harrington, who'd been on the bench for 30 years and had handled countless criminal cases, looked at Rebecca with an expression of profound sadness mixed with stern judgment. "Ms. Winters," Judge Harrington said, "what you did to Dorothy Ashford was premeditated murder. You selected a victim who loved you, who trusted you, who treated you as a daughter. You systematically poisoned her body over many months, watching her suffer, watching her decline, knowing exactly what you were doing. You lied about it. You covered it up. And you only stopped when you decided to give her a final fatal dose because she was threatening to expose you." The judge paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "There is no rehabilitation for someone who could do what you did. There is no amount of time that will change who you are or what you're capable of. And therefore, I have no choice but to impose the maximum sentence available to me. Rebecca Winters, I am sentencing you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. You will spend the rest of your natural life incarcerated. You will never be released. You will die in prison. And perhaps in that time, you will come to understand the enormity of what you've done and the life you've taken from everyone who loved Dorothy Ashford." The gavel came down. Rebecca was led away by guards. As she was being taken from the courtroom, she finally looked at Patricia. For just a moment their eyes met. Patricia saw something in Rebecca's eyes that was almost like regret, but not quite. It was more like recognition, the recognition of someone who understood that the game was over, that she'd lost, that there was nothing left to do but accept her punishment. The case became a nationwide sensation. It was covered by every major news outlet. Rebecca Winters became the face of a particular kind of evil, not the violent kind but the calculated, premeditated kind. The kind where someone slowly poisons the person they're supposed to love, all for money. It was a story that captured people's imagination and their horror in equal measure. Documentaries were made about the case. True crime podcasts covered it extensively. Journalists wrote articles asking the question, how does someone become capable of doing something like this? What is it in a person's psychology that allows them to commit such a calculated and cruel murder? Rebecca's story became a cautionary tale about what untreated mental illness and obsession could lead to. It became a warning about the importance of paying attention to warning signs in relationships, about trusting your instincts when something feels off, about the danger that can lurk within families. For Patricia and her brothers, the years that followed Dorothy's death and Rebecca's conviction were complicated. They had to process the grief of losing their mother, but they also had to come to terms with the fact that their mother had been murdered by someone in the family, someone they'd all trusted and welcomed into their lives. They had to rebuild their relationships with David, who was devastated by what his wife had done and who struggled with guilt for not believing his mother sooner. David filed for divorce from Rebecca while she was in prison. He got full custody of Sophie, Rebecca's daughter, and he spent years trying to help his daughter understand who her mother was and what she'd done, trying to help her process the trauma of having a mother who was a convicted murderer, trying to give her as normal a life as possible given the circumstances. Patricia threw herself into advocacy around the issue of elder abuse and poisoning. She spoke at conferences. She wrote articles. She worked with law enforcement to help them understand the signs of poisoning in elderly populations. She wanted to make sure that what happened to her mother never happened to anyone else. The years in prison changed Rebecca. Or perhaps they didn't change her so much as they revealed who she'd always been underneath the professional facade and the performative emotions. She was cold, calculating, intelligent, and absolutely remorseless. She spent her years in prison working in the prison hospital, using her nursing skills in a way that was carefully monitored by the administration. She didn't cause any trouble. She didn't try to escape. She simply existed in a kind of functional resignation to her fate. She was eligible to give interviews and she occasionally did. She talked about her childhood, about her struggles with infertility, about the depression that had consumed her. She talked about how she'd been driven to do something terrible by a desperate need to have a child, to have the things that other people had, to build the life that she felt she deserved. But she never expressed genuine remorse. She never apologized for what she'd done. She never acknowledged the specific cruelty of choosing Dorothy, of using someone who loved her, of poisoning her slowly and deliberately over months. She spoke about her crime as if it were something that had happened to her, rather than something she had chosen to do. In 2025, 10 years after her conviction, Rebecca Winters is still in prison in Colorado. She is 58 years old now. She will spend the rest of her life behind bars. She will never be free. She will never see her daughter Sophie graduate from high school, never see her get married, never see her have children of her own. She will die in prison alone, as Judge Harrington said she would. Sophie, Rebecca's daughter, grew up knowing who her mother was and what she'd done. She changed her last name to her father's name, David's name. She has tried to build a life separate from the legacy of her mother's crime. She is in college now, studying to be a social worker, wanting to help people who are in situations similar to the ones Rebecca had been in, situations where mental illness and desperation and lack of support led to tragedy. Patricia founded an organization called Dorothy's Voice, dedicated to protecting elderly people from poisoning and abuse. She speaks at hospitals and police departments across the country. She has trained thousands of people to recognize the warning signs of poisoning, the unusual symptoms, the pattern of illness that follows certain people's presence, the journals or notes that a victim might keep documenting their suspicions. Dorothy's legacy is complicated. She was a victim, certainly, but she was also brave. She documented her own poisoning. She confided in her family. She fought back even though she was dying, even though she had no way to stop what was happening to her. And because of what she did, because of the evidence she left behind, her murderer was brought to justice. Her family, in Dorothy's memory, has made sure that the story of her death is not forgotten, that it serves as a warning to others, that it leads to changes in how we protect our vulnerable populations from predators within their own families. Comment below one final time and tell me, what did you think of this case? Did you see this coming? Were there moments where you thought Rebecca might get away with it? And what do you think about the sentence? Do you think life without parole is justice, or do you think Rebecca deserved something different? I want to hear your thoughts because this case raises important questions about justice, about redemption, about whether anyone is truly beyond rehabilitation. If this story has impacted you, if you found yourself horrified and angry and heartbroken by what happened to Dorothy, please consider subscribing to this channel. We tell the stories that matter, the stories that reveal the darkness that can hide within families and communities. We explore not just the crime but the people involved, the victims, the perpetrators, the families left behind to pick up the pieces. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about Dorothy's story. Thank you for understanding that true crime is not just entertainment. It's a way of bearing witness to tragedy, of making sure that the people whose lives were stolen are not forgotten, and of learning from history so that perhaps, in some small way, we can prevent future tragedies from occurring. Stay safe. Take care of each other. And remember, if something feels wrong in a relationship, trust your instincts. If someone you love is experiencing unusual symptoms, especially if they're correlated with one person's presence, take it seriously. Pay attention. Speak up. Because Dorothy paid with her life for not being listened to, and her story should teach us all the importance of believing our loved ones when they tell us something is wrong. This has been the story of Rebecca Winters and the poisoning of Dorothy Ashford. I'm your host, and I'll see you next time on Dark Echoes Crime, where we explore the stories that the mainstream media often overlooks, the stories that matter, the stories that deserve to be told.